On BBC Two now, Europe Decides. David Dimbleby, Peter Snow and the team take us through an evening of discussion, reaction and, most importantly, the results of the European parliamentary elections.
Tonight, the results of the elections to the European Parliament from Britain and around Europe. Welcome to our Euro Café, where there'll be congratulations and commiserations throughout the night. And down here on the floor, below the Euro Café up there, we'll be analysing the new makeup of what is the only international parliament in the world. We'll be trying to work out what message was being sent by those who voted and also by those who didn't vote. Remember, in Britain, 3 out of 4 of us didn't actually go to the polls, the lowest turnout in a nationwide election in British electoral history, and far lower than previous Euro elections. We've got the results of our election night poll. We haven't got more than a smattering of results in yet, but the poll confirms the suspicions of the political parties that it's going to be a close-run thing tonight between Labour and Conservative for first place. Labour has been hit by fewer of its supporters going to the polls, and by some of those who did go to the polls switching away from Labour to other parties. It also looks as though the Green Party and Plaid Cymru may get their first members of the European Parliament. And with, of course, the change to proportional representation, which we'll be hearing a lot about tonight, the Liberal Democrats are going to make a strong showing compared with what they did back in 1994. Now, it looks as though the same shift to the right has taken place right across Europe, so we'll have the figures on that later on. Now, tonight, the counting, this is, remember, the first election in which the whole of the United Kingdom has been under proportional representation, is going to be conducted in a rather different way from usual. Let me just briefly explain it. The votes are all going to be counted first in the normal parliamentary constituencies. Then the numbers are going to be passed to the big regional headquarters, 9 of them in England, 1 each in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. And there the grand total will be added up and then shared out between the parties, and the new members of the European Parliament for those regions then announced. You'll also, though, see the results of each individual parliamentary constituency coming up on the bottom of the screen as we get them. So you'll be able to see what each constituency has done. Remember, that doesn't actually decide anything because it all has to be added up at regional level. But you will see that. We'll bring you the details of the regional results when all the sums are done at those centres. But also tonight, of course, we're going to be reporting on political trends in Europe as a whole, the other 14 countries, most of whom voted today, not like us back on Thursday, and they'll be counting their votes. We talk about that apparent trend to the right. We'll be seeing how that's borne out as the results come in. We're going to be going to the key centres of political power in Europe, where the big decisions that influence the future of the European Union are taken. For instance, to Berlin, from where Justin Webb now reports.
Here in Berlin, Chancellor Schröder's Social Democrats and their main coalition partners, the Greens, appear to have lost ground. The war in Kosovo apparently responsible. The main gainers have been the main opposition party, the Christian Democrats. So, what is happening? Are Germany's voters simply making a comment on domestic politics, or are they saying something more fundamental about their nation's place in Europe?
Here in Paris, we've had an early exit poll. It seems to be a good night for the Greens. The first poll put them at 11.5%. The centre-right is definitely divided over pro-Europeans and Eurosceptics. The people here will be watching to see if the governing socialists are falling under their usual 20%, and if Jean-Marie Le Pen's National Front has been challenged by his new rival, Bruno Maigret.
Well, here I am in the land of the midnight sun, where, as you can see in the summer, it never gets dark. People here haven't bothered to go to the polls in Finland's lowest ever turnout. As Finland is set to take over the EU presidency, later in the programme, its Prime Minister tells us why he believes it's in a unique position to help shape the EU's future.
The whole European project has often been compared with a train, so I spent the day on Eurostar, travelling to Paris and back. talking to anyone who'll talk to me about whether they consider themselves to be European and how do they see the whole future of Europe.
So we'll have more about Europe later on, but let's now go back to Britain and to our election night poll and to other information we've got in so far. Peter, can you explain a bit more?
Well, David, yes, I mean, the big story, it looks like a big story all over Europe, is the lack of enthusiasm for this, with some exceptions, for this European parliamentary election. The European Parliament have unwisely decided to publicise this election by sending a hot air balloon all over the country, a great big blue thing with lots of stars on it. So we've decided to take a leaf out of their book and put all our hot air into a few balloons as well, just to judge how each country has been performing in this European election. First, then, let's have a look by just floating up here all the countries where we've had an indication so far of turnout, including, of course, the dear old Union Jack over here, and have a look at the turnout in them. Now, what we're doing with the aeroplane there is just going to draw a line in the sky along here, a nice vapor trail, so that we can push up our balloons. There we go, thank you very much. Now, here we go. Starting with Belgium. It's compulsory to vote in Belgium. It's a civic duty in Greece. The Greeks don't take too much as a civic duty, but there we are, 74%, not bad. They're actually up a bit on last time. And here we have Denmark, here we have Germany. Germany, huge drop, 13% down on where they were last time. Ireland up a tiny bit. And here we have the Netherlands and Britain, of course, down by 13% on last time, down to 23%, the worst ever turnout in any national election. There on the left, then, looking in a bit more detail at Britain, is the 23% turnout that we have. Who has it hurt? Well, look at this. In safe Labour seats, the turnout was 18%. In safe Conservative seats, the turnout was 28%. Now, that clearly indicates the Tories are more enthusiastic about turning out at this election than Labour. So that's one indicator that's been bad for Labour, the turnout drop. Our second indicator is this. Who stayed at home? We talked to people before and after they'd voted. 4,000 people we spoke to all over the country. 23% of those who told us they were going to vote Liberal Democrat told us afterwards they'd stayed at home, hadn't voted at all. Of those who said they were going to vote Conservative, 24% told us afterwards they'd stayed at home. Of those who said they were going to vote Labour, 1/3 altogether said they had actually stayed at home and not voted Labour. And another indicator, something else happening to Labour, not just the turnout, but also loyalty of their voters in 1997. Here are all those who voted Conservative in 1997, who voted this time as well, telling us that 67% of them stayed loyal to the Conservatives. So 2/3 of those who voted Conservative in 1997 general election voted Conservative this time. Labour, however, of Labour voters in 1997, only just over half, 58%, stayed loyal to Labour. So clearly people are deserting Labour and voting for other parties as well as not turning out for Labour, David.
Peter, thanks very much. We've got one result from Greenock and Inverclyde. I don't know whether we can show it. There it is. Now this, remember, is a constituency result. It's only a first straw in the wind from Scotland, showing Labour on 32.9, SNP, Scottish Nationalists, on 23.8, Conservatives in third place. Now the interesting thing is the change here. We get first of all the share figure and now the change. And the change is comparing it to the general election. And Labour down 23%, which is more than our polls were predicting. SNP up 5%. Well, it's the first result in, that's why we gave it. I dare say all will change from that. But anyway, it's obviously not a very happy result on the face of it for Labour. But let's go now up to the Euro Café behind us there. Strictly, I have to say, non-alcoholic, rather sad, but anyway, it is, where voters and non-voters who've been drawn from our poll, and also some special guests with an interest or an involvement in things European, are going to be talking during the night to their host up there, Sian Williams. Sian.
Yes, only cappuccinos up here, although we're hoping that may change a little later on in the evening. Welcome to our Euro Café, where we're going to be getting reaction to the results as they come in from some of the people who took part in that voter poll. And as David and Peter were saying, one of the most important things about this election so far seems to have been how few people actually made it out to the polls. They just didn't bother. Now, whose fault was that, and how could they have been encouraged to go? Well, Eddie, I know you didn't vote this time. What might have made you go to the polls?
Probably more information at the end of the day. I mean, people don't want to vote if they don't know what they're voting for. And I think really the amount of information that's around and what's in the papers, on the TV, I'd rather not vote than vote for someone wrong, really, at the end of the day.
So it was a stronger campaign. Is that what you would have liked to have seen, Jo?
Yes, I think there was very little in newspapers, television, radio, so I don't think that a lot of people noticed that we were having an election at all.
What about compulsory voting? Because they have that in places like Greece and Belgium. Would that work?
I think that's quite tough, but I like the idea of it being a civic duty, so maybe through education, starting with people younger, teaching them about why it's important to vote.
OK, so citizenship classes, that's one idea from Jo. Maybe also weekend voting or having a day off during the week, or even polling booths in supermarkets might be an option. Brian, you didn't vote. What might have made you vote?
I was too busy. I couldn't get there at the end of the day. If I could have voted on the internet or something like that, it would have been much preferable to me.
And Gary?
Digital TV, if it was there, it would have been a lot easier to vote at the end of the day, so, yeah.
All right, well, it seems as though if there were more information about the campaign and if there were easier ways of voting, then perhaps more people would have done so. David?
Thanks so much, Sian. We've got another result in Sunderland South. On the basis of the turnout in most of England, it won't have taken long to count some of these constituents. Sunderland's always quite a quick counter, but there's the result there. Labour 4,700, Conservatives 3,500 or so, Labour 44%, Conservatives 31, Liberal Democrats 8, and others 15, and the change since the general election, 23% down for Labour, 12% up for the Conservatives. That confirms what we've been saying, that Conservatives are more likely to go to the polls, and Labour is having a problem getting out its vote. Now, the counting started actually about 45 minutes ago, so it is beginning to get going in the constituencies. It'll be a bit of time before we get a regional count, but let's just see what's going on in the regions. We start at Alexandra Palace, built, as Tony Blair would no doubt approve of this, the People's Palace in 1873. And what I would approve of, it was where the BBC first started television transmissions in 1936. But tonight, it's where the London regional count is happening. And Nicky Campbell is there.
Yes, you might not approve of the fact that it's also non-alcoholic here this evening. You may, of course, be forgiven for thinking that we're in Luxor or the Valley of the Kings, but we are at the Palm Court restaurant here at, as David was saying, the aforementioned very prestigious and famous and historic Alexandra Palace. And it's a good place to be tonight because London is a place which traditionally very accurately reflects the national picture. Remember, of course, during the Thatcher years in the 80s, it was massively Tory, and then there was that extraordinary New Labour cavalry charge reflected here in 1997. And because there are so many votes to be had here in London tonight, a lot of the smaller parties are licking their lips in anticipation. And talking to people here tonight, I can particularly tell you that people from the UK Independence Party are feeling quite optimistic about what could turn out to be a good night for them, relatively speaking. Another big talking point has been the ballot paper. And have a look at that. It's enormous. Now, a lot of trees have perished in the noble cause of democracy, but never mind the deforestation. Have a look at the width. Another bone of contention, we go right from one side there where it says mark in one box, and the box to which it points is the box of the British National Party. Now, whether that potential obfuscation is going to be for their benefit, time will only tell. And we go right the way across, 22 inches in all, right the way to the candidate at the other side, who is the candidate for the Hemp Coalition. Another interesting fact about this paper, it's so unwieldy, so difficult to fold up and to manipulate, that a lot of the counters have been reporting a new phenomenon, perhaps, to British elections. You've heard of tennis elbow. They're reporting election paper finger, because they're getting a lot of cuts and lacerations as they're folding them up. I'll show you where they are in just a second. There is the results board there. The share of the vote and all the results will be displayed on there later on. And then through there, in the hall, braving those laceration and cuts to their digits, are the brave counters. You'll see a number of them are actually, because of the unwieldy size of this ballot paper, having to actually stand up rather than sit down and count at their leisure with their posteriors on their seats. So that's another first for a British election. Good place to be tonight, as I say. We'll be back with you sporadically. And there's some interesting people milling around. Arthur Scargill, interestingly, is standing here for the Socialist Labour Party. He is, unsurprisingly, top of their list. He's chosen not to stand in the traditional mining heartlands of the north of England. Also, Simon Hughes will be around here, pressing the Liberal Democrat fresh from his announcement that he's standing for the leadership of that party. And interestingly as well, Pauline Green, who is topping the New Labour list. She's the leader of the socialist group in the European Parliament. And we'll be back with you later. Back to the studio.
Thanks so much. Well, we'll indeed join you later. Now we've got another result in. Let's just see this. Barnsley Central, the first one from Yorkshire and the Humber. That's the region for the European election. Labour, 3,800. The Conservatives, 1,600. Liberal Democrats, 1,000. Others, 1,400. But again, look at the change. This is the share of that very small vote in Barnsley Central. Labour down 27%. The Conservatives up 10% on their share of vote. I have to make this clear. The share of vote at the general election. It's not to do with the actual numbers of votes cast. It's the share of the vote. And it doesn't, of course, amount to a row of beans until it's all added up and we know what the result for Yorkshire and the Humber is. Well, now let's go to Scotland, where Eddie Mair joins us. And Eddie, just tell us what the news is from there. There's been a very low turnout in Scotland, I gather.
There has. We won't get the full turnout figure till tomorrow for reasons which I'll explain later. The estimate from here in Edinburgh, this is where all the Edinburgh parliamentary constituencies are having their votes counted, is 28.7%. But there is an estimate that across the country, across Scotland, it'll be an 18% turnout, so lower than the UK as a whole. Things are rather lower tech than Nikki at Alexandra Palace. We've just got the old-fashioned platform and microphones there. But the parties are hopeful of making gains, except Labour. Labour in Scotland seem to accept, as they have done throughout the UK, that this might not be a good night for them. The Scottish Conservatives may be the party to watch tonight in Scotland. Of course, they were wiped out at the last general election, but thanks to proportional representation, made gains in the Scottish Parliament, and they're hopeful they will take one seat here tonight. Privately, they have hopes of taking two. Equally, the SNP, who had 2 seats in the last Parliament, they're hoping to maintain that, and maybe... Excuse me, it's the only bit of excitement we've had here tonight, and it may be the only one we get. The SNP hoping to take 3 seats, and the difficulty for us is there will be no result tonight for the whole of Scotland. The Western Isles have decided not to count today for religious reasons, and their example was followed by other places across Scotland, including Orkney and Shetland, and the 3 Aberdeen constituencies. So they're going to start counting tomorrow, which means we won't be able to get a Scotland-wide result until probably around 10:30, 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. The plan is then that around lunchtime tomorrow, the 8 new MEPs for Scotland will parade themselves through the streets of Edinburgh.
Okay, thanks very much, Eddie Mair. I gather our little machine showing how various constituencies have gone has temporarily given up the ghost. I don't know whether we can show anything more. I think it'll be there in a moment. We've got a result from Hemsworth. Barnsley Central? No? Well, we've had half a dozen, or we've had 8 or so, but I won't give them to you at the moment. Let's go to Wales, first of all, and join Gita Harry, who's there. Gita.
Yes, David, believe it or not, you join us from a very beautiful part of Wales. You can't see that from this shed where we're actually spending tonight. There are 2 counts taking place here, but this, more importantly, is where all the Welsh results will come into and the final equation and the balance of seats eventually worked out by the end of the evening. It is early days, obviously, at the moment, but even at this early stage, I can tell you that very senior figures in the Welsh Labour Party are bracing themselves for a very bad result indeed. They're talking, some of them, about losing 4 out of 5 seats. That's just some of them. They might be trying to mislead us, but some of them are seriously worried. And what they are taking for granted is that the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, has actually polled more votes in Wales last Thursday than Labour has.
We've got I just got confirmation about Barnsley Central from our psephologist that it looks as though that on average the Labour vote is falling by around 25 percentage points, while the Conservative vote is well up. So, but those are all so far in fairly safe Labour seats, which perhaps is influencing it. Right, let's go to the South East region and join Jackie Ashley. Jackie, the South East is where the Greens are hoping to take their seat, isn't it? Or take 1 seat anyway in the European Parliament.
That's right, David, and they're very optimistic here tonight. The South East is the biggest electoral region. There are 11 seats up for grabs, but because of the way the arithmetic works out, the parties need a fairly low threshold, only around 8%, to actually win a seat, and the Greens are fairly hopeful they've done that. There's been a degree of detective work going on at the verification procedure, which took place on Thursday night. Then the ballot papers are counted, but face down, so you can't actually see who's voted for which party. But they've all been looking through what they say were fairly thin ballot papers. And the Greens are saying they reckon on that rather sort of dubious way of counting, they've got about 10%. So they're really very optimistic tonight that they could take their first ever seat in the European Parliament.
And turnout down there, well, you don't know the turnout by individual. Oh, we do know the turnout.
We do,
yes.
David. It's 24% on average, but that varies tremendously within the region. It is a very big region. Here in Winchester, it's around 32%, but in Slough, it's 15%. So it's low always round, but it's particularly low in some areas.
11 seats. And how big is the electorate there?
I haven't got that figure to hand, I'm afraid, David.
Sorry.
You're going to have that in London.
No, nearly 6 million. No, I was just it's interesting to compare it with the Scottish electorate. It's the southeast of England has nearly 6 million. Scottish electorate is just under 4 million. Anyway.
And in fact, we can confirm from here, David, just as you're finding all over the country, that the Labour vote is right down. Everyone is saying it's the Labour voters who haven't turned out. So that seems to be a story which is being repeated here as it is all over the area.
Jackie, thanks so much. We'll be back with you. Well, now, here around this elegant table to try and make sense of these elections, we're joined by, first of all, Alison Park, who researches elections and social trends, the two together. Professor Anthony King of Essex University, well known on these occasions, is also sitting on the Royal Commission on the Future of the House of Lords. And Julie Smith from the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the University of Cambridge, who's written a book about the European Parliament and knows far too much about it for anybody's good. And on the other side of the table here, Margaret Beckett, the leader of the House of Commons, who's been running Labour's election campaign. There's come into some criticism about that. We'll be talking to her about it. Michael Ancram, the chairman of the Conservative Party, and Mingus Campbell, Liberal Democrat Foreign Affairs spokesman and a man who declined to run for the leadership of the Liberal Democrats. Well, Margaret Beckett, let's start with the turnout. We'll come to all the problems it may pose for Labour, but why do you think it is, fundamentally, that people haven't gone to the polls?
Well, what's particularly interesting and really quite alarming, I think, is that from what we know, it does look as if turnout is down very dramatically on previous turnout right across Europe. And obviously our turnout has always been pretty low in the Euro elections, so that does put us in very low territory.
But why do you think it is? Because you're the party that extols the virtue of Europe, and then nobody votes.
Oh, but in the local elections, we had the lowest ever turnout for local elections in May.
Are
and
they
it
the
does
same
seem
thing,
to be,
the two?
No, but what tends to happen is that the Euro election turnout tends to be below the locals. They were the lowest ever. This is the lowest ever. I suspect it's a mix of factors. I noticed that I think it was Eddie and Brian who both said they'd have liked more information, they'd have liked to hear more about the campaign. Coverage, understandably, of events in Kosovo and even to a slightly lesser extent in Ireland really squeezed out the campaign to a very large extent, and I think that meant everybody had difficulty getting their message across, and that's bound to make a difference.
So how is it that the Conservatives got their vote out better than Labour?
Well, the Conservatives have undoubtedly sought to present themselves as a completely anti-European party. They've gone very much for short-term gain. In the short term, it may have helped them. In the long term, I suspect it's going to turn out to be a huge strategic mistake.
But you mean that people are keener to vote against Europe than they are to vote for it?
I think the people who are against Europe, and in particular the people who are against the single currency, are passionately against it. And I think it's interesting. Well, we don't know enough of the figures yet, but if after the campaign they've run and the degree to which they've gone anti-Europe, anti-single currency, if the Conservatives still have got historically a relatively low turnout, then I think that in itself will be interesting, and I think the tactics are long-term very damaging for them.
Michael Ancram?
Well, it's a myth that we fought an anti-European campaign. Our slogan said said in Europe, but not run by Europe, and that was the slogan which a lot of people on the streets were telling us they agreed with. Can I say, I think there are a number of reasons. One of the reasons is we actually fought a campaign. I don't think the Labour Party bothered too much about this campaign because they were frightened that the electorate might really get to know what their policy on Europe was. I'd like to pay tribute to our workers right throughout the country who worked very hard on Thursday to get our vote out, and I think that partly explains why we've managed to get our vote out, particularly in our own areas. At the same time, I think we put forward a very clear message. It was a very broad message. It was a message which we got across, despite all the difficulties that Margaret's talked about, and I think we're beginning to see the signs of that success coming through already.
But, I mean, do you see it as an endorsement of your anti-Euro policy and at least a sort of scepticism about Europe? Is that what you read into it?
I think it's a message from people in the country who went to vote that they found what we were proposing, which was summed up in that phrase, being in Europe, that is, being part of Europe, but not being dictated to from Brussels. They found that the message that they wanted to give the government at this moment. We were the only party that could allow them to do that.
Is shaking his head and looking rather sad at this interpretation.
Well, they have to understand what this rather banal slogan actually means before they can give any kind of effect to it. I think we're suffering from voter fatigue. That's certainly the case in Scotland. After all, they've virtually had a 2-year campaign following the general election on the issue of Scottish Home Rule. And I think the fact that these elections come so hard after the local authority elections of last month has undoubtedly been a contributory factor. But then, so far as the Conservatives are concerned, if they're not a Eurosceptical party, why is it that they're threatening to expel Ian Gilmore, Tim Rathbone and Julian Critchley, people who were in the centre of the Conservative Party, but who are deeply disaffected by the sceptical line which has been taken for what are undoubtedly short-term tactical advantages, but which I believe will do the Conservative Party great damage in the future.
But how do you interpret the Tories getting a better turnout than Labour, or indeed the Liberal Democrats?
Because I think on all the examples we've seen, the Liberal Democrats show the vote has actually gone up.
Stayed the same, or gone up a little bit.
Yeah. But I think the answer is largely as Margaret Beckett has put it, that if you are deeply opposed to something, then you'll turn out and vote against it. That, I think, is the reason for the increased Conservative share of the vote, and that was the tactic the Conservative Party employed. One of the consequences of this success may well be that they'll split their party.
David, can I just in answer to Ming, I've listened to Ming for many years telling me that if we had proportional representation...
Nothing to do with proportional representation.
No, if we had proportional representation,
nothing at all to do with proportional
everybody was going to
representation.
come out and vote. This was
Nothing
the great
at all to
Liberal
do with
line.
proportional
Tonight we're hearing every excuse in the book for the low turnout other than that.
Okay, Alison Park has been listening to this, who, as I said at the beginning, is an expert in why people do what they do and why they turn out or don't turn out. What do you make of what you've heard? And whose version do you find closest to the truth as you see it?
Well, I think there's actually a little bit of truth in what everybody's said. European election turnout is always much lower than local election turnout and substantially lower than general election turnout. I think probably what's more interesting for tonight is the fact that turnout looks as though it's hitting certain areas, low turnout is hitting certain areas more than others, and I think that Labour are going to be the party that really suffer from that. We've seen earlier on in Peter's graphics that turnout in traditional Labour strongholds and areas where Labour did very well in the general election is much, much lower than one would expect.
And is there a reason for that you can discern?
Well, those sorts of areas, turnout is usually lower.
Why?
Well,
I mean, what sort of areas are you talking about?
I'm talking in many cases, the sorts of results that have come in so far are areas where there's high levels of unemployment, high levels of relative deprivation, high levels of council home ownership and so on. And in those sorts of areas, turnout does tend to be lower than average.
Tony King, what do you attribute it to, this Britain being so far behind, as Peter's balloons showed, so far behind the rest of Europe in turnout terms?
Well, the British are a very pragmatic lot, and they tend to turn out to vote when they think they have an important decision to take. They'll vote in a general election to elect a government. They'll vote in a very important referendum, as we saw in Scotland, where some big issue is to be determined. I think the simple bottom line fact is that most people in Britain on Thursday didn't think anything much was at stake. Why bother to turn out? There's another factor that everybody's much too polite to mention. It would be interesting in the course of the evening to ask the three distinguished politicians opposite whether they would consider standing for the European Parliament. The fact is, if you go through the lists of candidates on those enormous ballot papers, the vast majority of people have never heard of more than one or two of them. There are no stars, there are no big people in European politics in Britain.
Gina Lollobrigida in Italy, but no equivalent in Britain. But would that really get the vote out?
I don't think
what the equivalent of Gina Lollobrigida from Britain is, actually, come to think of it. I'm not sure there is one.
I don't think you want film stars or retired film stars. You want really heavyweight politicians.
But would that really make a difference?
And incidentally, it does look at the moment that there's every prospect that at the end of tonight, despite a Labour government at Westminster with an overwhelming majority, there's every prospect that at the end of tonight, the Conservative Party is going to have a larger share of the vote than the Labour Party, partly for the reasons we've just been talking about.
But if that happens, is that also sending a message about Labour's policy towards Europe Labour leading Europe, as the Prime Minister said, Labour proposing to have a referendum and a decision on the euro after the next general election.
A little
I mean, is
bit
it
of a
comment
message,
on that?
but I wouldn't overdo it. I suspect at the end of the night, even if the Conservatives emerge as the larger party, the pro-European parties will actually have together a larger share of the vote.
Okay. Peter, let's just have a look at how much have we got in from Europe so far?
Well, the European Parliament, quite a lot of exit polls and quite a lot of first information about the shape of the Parliament. The irony of all this is, though, David, that if Tony King is right, all these very grey people, all these grey MEPs, these anonymous people, are going to one of the most flamboyant Parliament buildings in the world. Let's take a trip to Strasbourg. This is the old Parliament here. You see tucked away down there where the European Parliament used to be. But look here, this incredible £350 million building over the other side of the River Ill is where the new European Parliament is going to be. We'll just zip inside there and show you the new chamber. It's not quite the size of the Albert Hall, but it's mighty big. Each MEP is going to have his own office or her own office with a bathroom en suite. Very exciting. A huge Parliament, massive building, and a massive tower above it. Now, here's the old European Parliament. This is the one that was elected in 1994 in 3 countries in 1996, and it's been there for 5 years. And you can see the broad shape of it there. Over there, the United Left, 34, Greens, 27. Socialists and centre-right, we've broadly grouped over there. The centre-left parties, the Socialists on 235, the centre-right here, including the British Conservatives, on 235 as well, almost exactly evenly. Liberals in the middle there, the far right, and the others over here on 17. Now, what's happened in this election? This is all very much early days, a lot of exit pollery. Of course, we've no idea exactly what's happening in this country yet. It's far too early to be sure. But here we have the United Left. And our first estimate is that the United Left, which includes the Communist Party and other extreme left parties, will be up by 6 to 40 by the end of the counts. Here are the Greens. We think the Greens are going to do rather well. They were 27. We reckon they're going to end up at 38, up 11. Again, very early days, early forecasts. It could change a bit later on in the evening. Here we have now the biggest of the well, two of the big parties, the centre-left and the centre-right. The Socialists first, 235. That includes the ERA, the European Radical Alliance. We've lumped them all together to make it a bit simpler. We reckon that they're going to be dropping by some 36 seats altogether. Of course, the Labour Party, with the new voting system here, almost certain to drop a lot of seats. Early guesswork, early estimates, we think it'll be down anyway. Here's the Liberals, including our Liberal Democrats. We think they're going to be up by about 6. The broad parties of the centre-right, or the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives in this country, 235 they used to be. We think they'll be up just a fraction by perhaps 3 members. Now we have the far right, 36 they used to be. We think there's going to be quite a big drop there. We think the National Front in France don't look too healthy. They've been split, of course, between 2 rival groups. And here we have the independents, including the Northern Ireland MPs and so on, all various other people, plus 27. A lot of people coming into Parliament. We're not quite sure which groups they'll join, so there's probably a rather hefty number there. Now, there then is the shape of the new European Parliament. Just having a look at this early stage of estimating the strengths of the various party groups, you can get a sense of where we are. There you have then the broad balance of it, down on the centre left a bit, up a touch on the centre right, but the far right down. It's all a bit of a muddle, but never mind. There's the broad message, that left's down a bit, the right's up a bit. And now we can take a look, again, an early stab, at the way we think swing has moved. The shift in left and right the way across Europe has shifted from 1994 until today. Now, what we've done is we've plonked in the basket of this socking great Euro balloon here all the leaders of all the countries in Europe. There's our Tony Blair next to Jospin and Gerhard Schröder over there. And we're going to send our balloon up. There we are, firing away. Up you go, go on. Right up above Europe. And we are just going to see now which way the left-right swing has moved. Here comes an airplane drawing a straight line. There we are. Good. Oops. Right, okay now. Okay, here's the swing. And there's a swing to the right. It's not very surprising because, of course, we do have here 11 of the 15 governments, which are centre-left governments. Perhaps it's not surprising the swing to the right. This is a very early stage, though, David, of early estimates.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, now, Tony King was saying a moment ago that people sort of didn't think this was an important enough vote for it to be worth turning out for. Julie, you've done a study of European Parliament. People are right, aren't they? The European Parliament is not yet like a national parliament. It doesn't yet have substantial powers. It only really has powers, apart from sacking the Commission, which it finally chose to do. It only really has powers to modify fairly minor legislation. That's the truth, isn't it?
No, it isn't. The irony is that now the European Parliament has a lot more powers than in the past. Voters have shown less interest. Political parties haven't campaigned. It's not just a phenomenon in Britain, but across the European Union, campaigning has been low-key. And yet the Parliament does have significant powers. It can amend legislation, it can veto legislation, and it can veto the European budget.
So do you think people don't understand what the Parliament does?
I think very much so.
Would you agree with that, Michael Ancram? Is that why there's a low turnout? People don't know what's going on, but it is important? Or do you think it's less important, and Tony's view that the voter is sensible and pragmatic to stay away?
I think that the average voter doesn't understand the technicalities of what the Parliament does, but they do understand that the Parliament has a broad influence. One of the points we've been campaigning on is this question of a centre-right or centre-left Parliament, because it's either going to be a regulatory or a deregulatory Europe that's going to emerge from it. People understand that, and they understand the influence of the Parliament in those areas. If you say to them, what precise powers does the Parliament have, what are the precise things that it can do, very few people do understand it.
But do you think it's important, Margaret Beckett, as a Parliament?
Oh yes, it's definitely important.
But I mean, you send all your has-beens there,
important.
don't you? You all parties send their has-beens.
No, we don't. We don't. And in fact, one of the things that has happened over the last 15 years or so is that we've seen a new generation of very, very effective parliamentarians actually choosing to go to Europe. I mean, it's certainly the case some years ago that some people did go to Europe as a stepping stone on the way to Westminster. But we've now seen a generation of people actually choosing to become European rather than Westminster parliamentarians. But you know, there's one factor that I don't think we should overlook. And incidentally, I don't want to spend time on this, but let me just say this nonsense about how we didn't campaign. We had as large and thorough a campaign this time as we did in 1994, and I know because I was in charge of it then as well. We had just the same number of press conferences and so on. We didn't get anything like the same coverage, which I would say is Kosovo and other things related. But insofar as there's been coverage of Europe and the European Parliament lately, naturally and understandably, because of the troubles and the rows, it's focused on things like fraud. So that, again, doesn't make it very attractive to people, even though it makes it all the more important that they vote for people who will actually tackle it.
Since you raised the question of your leadership, I mean, you were criticised for I quote from what the Scottish Record said, a senior Labour spokesman, admittedly anonymous, she's been useless, she's not been engaged, if she's in charge of the general election, we'll lose. They also said you're away on holiday for a week.
Yes, I know that the week's caravan holiday, I wish, David, I didn't go away for a week, and I didn't go away on a caravan holiday, but it's a terribly good story, I agree.
But were you away from your duties?
Yes, I took bank holiday and 2 other days off, and I don't apologise for it.
Part of the problem, I think, is that people get fed a pretty unremitting diet of anti-Europeanism in our newspapers. If it's not straight bananas, it's the end of the custard cream tart, things of that kind. And I think that conditions the attitude of a lot of people in Britain to Europe. And on the question of good quality people, well, we've got people like Sarah Ludford or Nick Clegg or Chris Huhne who would be an adornment to any parliament, and I don't accept the notion that the Liberal Democrats in particular send people to Europe because there has been.
And you don't accept that the appeal of it is the expenses and the money and the easy life?
It's not an easy life in any sense whatsoever if you take it seriously. It's by no means an easy life. There are well, the Liberal Democrats are the people who actually tried to force the Parliament to agree that people would only be entitled to claim the expenses they'd actually incurred. We've tried very hard to bring about the financial reform, which is essential.
Well, like the Eurovision Song Contest in some respects, which is that each country will be revealing during the evening how it's voted, and there are television programmes bringing this news. We thought you might like to see how some of this has been going this evening. Nisha Pillai has been watching the output from all over Europe. Nisha.
The Eurovision Song Contest is a very good analogy, David, because Dana, Euro songster, is standing in Ireland, one of the glamour candidates. You were talking about Gina Lollobrigida earlier. Yes, I've been looking at the TV pictures and the TV shows going on as we speak, and they're having a bit of a difficult time trying to inject a bit of pizzazz into these low-key elections in countries like Sweden and Finland. Sorry about the competition from behind me, but as I was saying, in some countries like Sweden, more people seem to have gone to the beach than bothered to turn out to the polls, but there have been some wacky events and some wild publicity stunts. Let's take a look at some of the highlights now.
The future direction of Europe will be settled by an ever-dwindling number of voters, it seems. Even the great and the good, who faithfully turned out to vote, looked a little lost in polling stations bristling with cameras rather than voters. In Germany, not known for its Euro apathy, the turnout was the lowest yet in a Euro election. According to the exit polls, Gerhard Schroeder's Red-Green coalition received quite a drubbing all the same. What did get voters out were local issues. These Portuguese villagers set fire to their ballot papers, would you believe, in protest of the state of the roads. In Belgium, where it's compulsory to vote, the dioxin chicken scandal got this voter clucking. For the Dahana government, whose future is also being decided today, things aren't looking good. Over at the shiny new Euro Parliament, there was quite a spread on offer for the Eurocrats anxious to hear their fate, guaranteed dioxin-free, of course. The new MEPs, who'll soon fill this chamber, will have their work cut out agreeing on the troublesome question of their pay and perks and how to deal with the European Commission. One of them could be none other than Jacques Santer, who the last Parliament chased out of the Commission because of allegations of fraud and mismanagement under his leadership.
Qui stiamo per parlare di un'elezione che è importante.
The Italians are making quite a lot of these elections, and the next Commission President will be Italian after all. But in Italy too, voter turnout looks disappointing, despite the attraction of one of the election's few out-and-out stars, Gina Lollobrigida. Unfortunately for Italian TV viewers, she's flown off to Germany to spend the evening on German TV for a hefty fee. This French election programme says Lionel Jospin's ruling socialists are heading for victory. But it's the Greens, the junior partners of the government, who are the surprise of the night, heading for their best Euro score yet. In fact, it's been a good night for the Greens right around Europe, except in Germany. So once again, small parties, the beneficiaries of low turnouts.
Good. Well, Nisha Pillai, keeping an eye during the evening on how that goes. Now we go to Brussels. We join Anne Mackenzie there. Anne, good evening.
Evening, David. Well, we're here in the European Parliament building where Euro enthusiasts at least have bothered to turn up to celebrate the elections. And although you wouldn't believe it from looking behind me, the building is actually packed with people drinking champagne. We unfortunately are not among them. I'm joined now by Sir Leon Britton, departing Conservative Commissioner, of course. And Sir Leon, the heart of Europe, but as far as the British public are concerned, we may as well be on another planet.
Well, the turnout has been very low. I think partly that has been because of the extraordinary proportional representation system, which is very unpopular and really must have been designed to put people off ever having proportional representation for Westminster, plus the fact that on the central issue of the euro, the government simply didn't engage, it didn't come out and present its case at all.
But that's interesting because your own party, Conservative Party, of course, did engage, and it seems that they have done apparently rather well at this stage. It seems that Mr. Hague has managed to tap into a policy that the British public appear to find popular.
Well, I think you would be very unwise to draw that conclusion, and in particular I think it would be a strategic error of heroic proportions to assume that because of this the road to victory of the next general election is to follow a Eurosceptic
It is what your own party is saying.
Yes, I think they're wrong, those who are saying it, and not everybody in the party is saying it. I think it would be a great error to believe that on a 24% poll, when you're getting your own party enthusiasts out, and that's the absolute sort of peak of your support for that, that means that when the issue is really engaged with the Labour Party, the Liberals and the Conservatives who are in favour of the European currency, that the result will be the same. This is a very, very dangerous assumption to make, and I hope that people will not draw the wrong conclusion from it.
But opinion polls have consistently shown that at least 50%, a solid 50% of the British public appear to be against a single currency. Wouldn't that seem to suggest that Mr. Hague is on to a good thing?
Well, you see, the job of politicians is to lead, not to follow. And I think that the question is what is in the interest of this country.
But, but obviously Mr. Hague believes this is in the interest of the country.
But I think, you see, this is nothing to go by at the moment, because we're not holding a referendum at the moment. We're not going to hold one for 2 or 3 years at least. And the Labour Party, rightly or wrongly, in my view wrongly, has failed to give the lead in this election, which has allowed the Conservatives to think, and not every Conservative does, to take that position.
But if you are looking at 50% of the electorate to feel strongly on an issue like the single currency, can you blame a party for following its conscience in this case, and actually tapping into that and representing these people?
I'm not blaming anyone, I'm just saying that it would be wrong to draw the wrong conclusions from it. And if you think that because on a 24% poll you can get your party activists out with enthusiasm on this, that is any indication of what would happen,
was a proper campaign with the other party pointing in the opposite direction. And we've had a poll today which has shown that if the government led on this, there would be a 7% difference, just like that, and that's without the government actually doing anything.
But that poll also showed that if Labour and the Liberal Democrats were to go for a single currency, a positive policy in a single currency at a general election, and the Conservatives were not, then something like 45% would vote for the Conservatives.
You can't, but there isn't going to be a general election for the moment. So I think that this business of, if you looked at what people thought was going to happen at a general election 3 years ahead of the actual general election any time in the past, you'd get the wrong result.
But Mr. Higgins...
And therefore there is something to be said for, instead of looking all the time at what the polls are saying, at asking what is right. Now those who believe that it's wrong for Britain to join the single currency are entitled to that view. I happen to believe the opposite, but I also think that if you're just going for it on the basis of what you think the people will want now, you can make a big mistake, because what people want now is not the same as what they will want in 3 years' time.
Where does this leave the Europhiles within your party? Because Mr. Hague has been under a lot of criticism from grandees, shall we say, like Michael Heseltine and Ken Clark. Yet this result would seem at least to underline Mr. Hague's position, seem to suggest that Mr. Hague is on to a good thing in terms of...
Well, in the short term that may be right, but it doesn't make the policy either right or electorally popular in the long run. And those of us in the Conservative Party, whether described as grandees or not, who believe that it is damaging and dangerous for Britain to be isolated from Europe and to be at the edge of Europe and the fringe of Europe, will continue to say so. And if the argument is about the single currency, we will continue to say what we think about that. And counting the numbers doesn't make it right or wrong when the future of the country is concerned, and when what is happening in Europe matters profoundly to people's jobs and to people's future.
Sir Leon, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Back to you, David.
Thanks very much. Well, now we've got a handful of gains by the Conservatives, either from Labour or the Liberal Democrats, in these constituencies. Let's just show you one as an example. Brigg & Goole, Conservatives 6,300. Look how low the vote actually is. 3,700 for Labour, the Liberal Democrats 1,600. This is the share of the vote in Brigg & Goole, which is another of the Yorkshire and the Humber region. 45% for the Conservatives, and the drop in the Labour vote, 23% down, the Conservatives 9% up, the Liberal Democrats up just 1.7%. And there'll be other examples like that. We're getting fairly close to having a clear picture now of what the overall result in terms of the percentage vote for the Conservatives and Labour will be, but Peter's working on that, and we'll give it to you as soon as we have it. In the meantime, let's just have a look at the German result. The opposition Christian Democrats have made big gains in Germany, a very dramatic night for them. They're getting almost, well, we'll see the figures at the moment, I think it's 49% of the vote. Chancellor Schröder's SPD fallen to second place, having just taken over as Chancellor. 47% turnout, the lowest ever for Germany in a European election. There's a lot of talk about how seriously Germany takes the European Parliament, not borne out by this turnout tonight. So the SPD on 31, the centre-right on 49, the Greens on 7, Free Democrats on 3, and this is the change since the election last autumn. You see the SPD has gone down 10%, 10 points that is, and 14 up for the Christian Democrats. Won't be very good news for Tony Blair, who launched his vision of the centre-left with Chancellor Schröder only a few days back. Anyway, let's go to Justin Webb, who's in Berlin. Justin.
I can confirm that we couldn't afford Gina Lollobrigida, but we've actually done one better at the end of the day, because I have with me noted commentator on German political affairs, Eckhard Birkenbusch, and I should perhaps point out before we speak a couple of the landmarks behind us, obviously the Brandenburg Gate, and I think you will also catch a glimpse in a second or two of the Reichstag, Norman Foster's Reichstag. Let's start with the turnout. If it turns out to be 47%, that is staggeringly bad by German standards, isn't it?
Yeah, people always believe the Germans are Euro enthusiasts, you know, they are not anymore. I mean, Euro enthusiasm has gone down over the last, well, 8 years, maybe 10 years, because people are fed up with what they see as corruption, dioxin chickens, BSE, and all these scandals, bureaucracy. They think Brussels is like a vacuum cleaner that sucks in money and nobody knows where it goes.
But the point has been made in the studio in London that this actually is going to be the most powerful European Parliament ever, and yet you're saying the Germans, who care about Europe, certainly care about it a lot more than the Brits do, still can't be bothered to take European-wide issues and European parliamentary issues seriously.
Yeah, they don't see it that way. I mean, they don't see that the European Parliament is so powerful. I mean, there's the Amsterdam Treaty that made it more powerful. But it's still about national issues. If you look at the election as it happened here in Germany, all the posters, it's all about national issues. They called it a test election, a referendum. I mean, the opposition said a referendum against the government.
And how badly has it gone for the government? How much of a bloody nose has Gerhard Schröder?
I mean, it is certainly a blow, but it's not a too severe a blow. I mean, there will be more regional elections in the autumn. Now, if the SPD gets a few more hammerings, then that will be disastrous.
And how much did the war in Kosovo muddy the waters? What effect actually has it had?
Not on, not for the big parties, because the ruling party, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democratic opposition, they were in one boat about this. But for the Greens, of course, I mean, a party that grew out of the pacifist movement, if the war was still going on now, if the bombing was still going on now, it would have meant sudden death to the Green Party, because it's split anyway. But now the war is over, so, for them, 6-point-something% is a little victory, because they expect it to be much lower in this election.
Eckhard Berkenbusch for the time being. Thank you very much indeed. That is it for the moment from Berlin. Back to you in London.
Earlier, has been travelling all day between London and Paris on the Eurostar, that great symbol of European cooperation and harmony, except when it breaks down or doesn't let you onto it, or goes the wrong way, or doesn't one other things that it occasionally does. But anyway, Michael Crick's been there. Michael, by the way, have you had a nice, safe journey all day, and have you got where you wanted to get?
Yes, a wonderful day. In fact, on both occasions the trains arrived early, so that's jolly good news. Didn't really have long enough in Paris to really enjoy it and to have a decent lunch, but they fed us well on the train, so that was great. And one of the reasons I went to Paris today was to test the whole question of how much things like Eurostar have contributed to a greater sense of Europeanism, or whether at the same time they've also helped to erode people's sense of national identity.
And on behalf of the onboard team, we would like to welcome you aboard this Eurostar service.
For more than a century, the idea of a Channel Tunnel rail link to France was seen as a means of binding Britain more tightly to the continent.
Well, here we are on the Eurostar. It's about, 40 minutes from London, trundling through the countryside, perhaps not as fast as we might like. And I've got a group of passengers here who are off to Paris, some of them on day trips. And I'm going to ask them about whether they feel they're European or French or British, depending on what they actually are. And Drula, do you regard yourself as British or European?
I think I'm British, although my parents are Greek Cypriot. I still class myself as British.
But I mean, shouldn't you, with a Greek Cypriot background, be European, really?
Maybe I should, but I was born here and lived here in England all my life, and I just class myself as British, I think.
Alain, are you French or are you European?
Depends also where I am. If I am in Southern Europe, in Spain or in Italy, or I'm coming from south of France, I feel easily European. If I am in Norway or in Denmark or in Sweden, I don't feel European at all.
Well, I don't understand that. Explain.
So for Southern French, it's quite easy to feel European if you are in Spain and Italy, because we are sharing the same cultural values. But it's quite difficult to feel European if you are in Norway or in Denmark or in Sweden.
Now, Rebecca, you're partly French and partly American. Does the French bit of you regard yourself as French or European?
If I'm in the United States, I'll feel European.
Really?
Yes.
And do you actually tell people you're European?
Absolutely. I'm a very good travel agent. However, if I am within Europe, if I am within France, and French people say, do you feel French? I feel confined within these limits, so I have to say, no, I feel more than that. And when I'm in Europe, I feel more than European.
Chris, how much is Europe an ideal for you?
I don't know on a personal kind of basis whether we can do that, but the thing is,
economically, I'm sure there will be eventually just one currency for the whole world, and
you mean it may not even be the euro?
It won't be the euro. No, it'll probably be the dollar. It depends on.
So the euro is just a sort of transitional arrangement.
Yeah, electronic trading, internet, whatever is going to, it will all sort of level out to a particular currency, and that will be it eventually.
Well, the view of Europe from the Eurostar. And now Peter Snow has got the result of the election in Britain, as told by the results we've had in so far, and our election night forecast. Peter.
Well, bear in mind that this is on a turnout of 23%, incredibly low turnout, but it's an incredible turnaround in political fortunes. Just look at this. Here we have our estimate of the share of the vote based on the results in so far. The Conservatives on 36%. The Labour Party on 29%. That is 15% lower than they were at the general election. That's 5% higher than the Tories were at the general election. And very much up on the last Euro election as well, needless to say, back in 1994. Here we have the Liberal Democrats on 17%, exactly where they were at the general election and much where they were at the European election 5 years ago. And the others on a hefty 18%. Seats, based on that forecast of the share. Now, of course, the seats now are proportional representation. They very closely mirror that share. Here is our forecast of the seats for the parties right the way across, from Labour here at 31 of the 84 seats in Great Britain, not including the 3 seats in Northern Ireland, 31 seats in Great Britain Labour, the Tories 4 higher than that on 35, the Liberal Democrats on 14 and the others on 4. Now, compare that with the seats that the parties held in the last European Parliament. 62 Labour seats, twice as many, but of course, these were first past the post elected seats where a small lead in share gave you an awful lot more seats, the British system, last time. So the Labour Party had 3/4 of the seats in the European Parliament as far as Britain was concerned. They're right down now to 31. Here are the Tories, almost doubling the number of seats, but of course a proportional representation hugely helps them. Here we have the Liberal Democrats on 14 seats, and here we have the others on 4 seats. Now what we've done is we've estimated what the seats would have looked like in 1994 if they had been elected by proportional representation, so we can get a fairly accurate comparison between the way the parties did in 1994 and the way the parties have done now. Here you have Labour, who would we think have got 43 seats in the last European election of 1994, when they did, by the way, very, very well indeed, down by 12 seats this time to 31. Here we have the Tories, who did extremely badly in 1994. We estimate on 25 seats, up by 10 to 35. Here we have the Liberal Democrats not doing very much, from 12 to 14. And here we have the others on much the same, on 4 down here. David.
Thanks, Peter. Margaret Beckett, it's not a very good night for Labour.
Well, I'm not happy about it, but I think it does go back to what we were saying earlier on. What the Conservatives have done is to mount a very extreme campaign. They've very strongly motivated people among their supporters who feel very passionately anti-Europe, and that has given them clearly an edge among those supporters. I suspect that in the populace as a whole, in normal times, they've painted themselves into a cul-de-sac because of the extremism and the far-right nature of that campaign. And it may have a very damaging impact even on their own party.
Isn't it the job of a party that opposes the Tories to get their vote out and counter the arguments? I mean, you had exactly the same facilities, the same campaign trail to go on. Why weren't you able, with a Prime Minister who's popular in the polls, to pursue the policies that you believe in?
Well, we
and
didn't have the same facilities. I mean, we mounted the same number of press conferences that they did. We had 250 ministerial visits since the local elections. People like John Prescott were indefatigable, trudging up and down the country, 2,500 miles, 30 towns and cities. Gordon Brown making major speeches, all of that. But we found it very hard to get coverage, and I fear one of the reasons is because most of the media were interested solely in the euro and in that aspect of the campaign because it was interesting. Every day the Conservatives had something new to say because they edged more and more to the extremes. We were saying the same thing throughout. The press find that very boring. At some of our daily press conferences, we almost outnumbered the media. And if you don't get your message through because the media aren't interested in it, then you always have a difficulty.
Well, I must say, for New Labour to blame the media for giving it inadequate
No,
coverage is a bit rich,
I'm
isn't
not
it? Because
blaming
you're generally
them.
deemed to be
No,
brilliant at
I'm not blaming
manipulating
them.
the
I'm
media.
saying the things that were of most interest to them were Kosovo and other general issues, and then what was of interest to them was the ever-changing extremism of the Tory party, and they really weren't very interested in anything we had to say.
But Margaret Beckett, I mean, to put it seriously, doesn't a sort of scintilla of doubt enter your mind about Labour's stance on Europe because of this result, that maybe the enthusiasm or apparent professed enthusiasm for the euro and for going to the heart of Europe isn't ringing a chord with your own supporters?
No,
ring a chord, strike a chord.
I don't doubt that our stance is right, because what we're saying is that we do think that in the long term it may be in Britain's interests, it will be in Britain's interests, to go into a successful euro, but that the time is not now, we're not ready now, the changeover plan hasn't been completed, we simply couldn't do it now. Now that's a more complicated message, and it's always harder to sell a complicated message, but it is in Britain's national interest.
Okay, Min Campbell, do you think that Labour failed to get their message across? I mean, do you blame the Prime Minister and the party for not getting this vote out and for apparently giving ground to the Tories on the scale they have?
Well, I think the issue of the euro was the issue of the campaign, although some parties did not actually raise it. And it's interesting, if these figures are proved to be correct, then we've gone from 2 to 14. And I think it's generally acknowledged that the Liberal Democrats tried throughout the campaign to run a pro-European campaign and to argue the case for the single European currency. On these figures, it does not appear to have damaged us. And I think there is a question for the Prime Minister, who's just shown remarkable leadership in relation to Kosovo. If he is genuinely of the view that the membership of the single European currency is in the interest of the people of the United Kingdom, then I think he's got to show the same kind of leadership on that issue as well.
But you didn't do any better than you had at the general election, did you? It was still 17%.
No, but we went from 2 to 14, if this is to be proved correct. And
because of PR, I mean,
indeed.
But in actual popular vote, the Liberal Democrats, the keenest pro-Europeans, you held your vote compared with the general election, it didn't go up.
Yes, but look at the background of this. I mean, who is going up? The anti-European party is going up. In those
well, then maybe you're wrong. Maybe the other parties are wrong and out of tune.
In those circumstances, for us to hold our vote in the way that we've done, if these figures are correct, seems to me to be entirely commendable. But just a small piece of history, if I may. The first European election that Paddy Ashdown fought as leader, we got 6% of the vote and no seats at all. Going out with 14 seats and 17% does represent.
But the same question I put to Margaret, does it occur to you that maybe you're out of touch with the public mood on Europe?
No, I think the case for the euro has not yet properly been made. And now that Michael Heseltine and Kenneth Clarke have passed through their self-denying ordinance with regard to the Conservative Party campaign, then I think we will have the all-party campaign which is necessary to win the referendum. After all, the success of the referendum on Europe previously in this country was because it was all-party based.
Okay, I want to go right round the country, but Michael Ancram, you're chairman of the Conservative Party. We haven't asked you to comment on these figures. Does this result, this 36%, if it comes out right like that, and I gather the Liberal Democrat is falling a little bit at the moment according to our interpretation, but if it is right, will you end your vendetta against people in the Conservative Party who disagree with William Hague's line?
Well, first of all, this is, if it turns out to be correct, this is a very good result for us. And Margaret says, you know, she couldn't get her message across. We actually challenged Tony Blair to a debate. I think Paddy Ashdown did as well. Which would have, well, you can imagine the publicity we'd have got for that. He said no, because he didn't want to actually face the public.
I don't remember.
No, because he was fighting a war in
I don't remember John Major agreeing to have a debate. Did he during the general election when he was challenged to have it?
But he didn't complain afterwards that he couldn't get his message across.
But there was a war
I don't think you can have it.
The Prime Minister did have other things to do.
Secondly, I let you have your say, Margaret. Secondly, Margaret has obviously taken the line which Alistair Campbell's given everybody. If the Tories are doing well, call them extreme. It's a very dangerous line because the manifesto on which we fought this election was very largely in tune, according to the opinion polls, with what the British people thought. And what she's saying is if we're extreme, they are extreme too. I don't believe that. We had a mainstream manifesto. People are showing in these elections that they supported that. They didn't like the headlong rush into a centralised, integrated Europe that both the other parties were putting forward.
OK, let's go and hear how this election is playing in other parts of the country.